The following story is also available as a read-only version. Check the link in the description if you're interested.
It wasn't his first heart attack, and for a moment, as he was clutching his chest in agony, he thought that it might not be his last. He fell to the ground, writhing as his torso constricted under the pressure of a million black ropes. The kitchen knife he had been holding, a piece of carrot still clinging to its blade, slithered across the ground. His last thought was of his great-granddaughter Kiri, 3 months old, and how he would not see her grow up. Then, after a final moment of painful euphoria, it all went to nothing. It felt warm for a second. Then it was hot. The old man opened his eyes and the world came into focus around him. It had been there before, existed forever, but only now became visible. He was floating in an egg-shaped cavern, thick black blood flowing from tiny holes in the jagged walls like putrid resin. Below his feet was lava, languidly bubbling, bathing the walls in an unsettling orange glow. Standing on a rocky pulpit, its features hidden in shadow, was a creature that, despite the heat, drove a shiver down the old man's spine. Though it seemed hunched over, it was much taller than any man he'd ever seen. Its caprine legs seemed tense with force, capable of great leaps, and powerful muscles were visible down to the individual strand beneath its kidney-colored skin. Long, white horns protruded from the being's head, which looked like a fleshless, deformed cranium. Fires burned in its eyes.
"Barnabas Mullins,"
it hissed.
"I'm afraid you've arrived at your final destination."
There was glee in its inhuman voice. "No, this is not real," Barnabas decided. "This was never meant to be real. I am not in hell." The demon laughed.
"Oh, but it is. And you know it is, because you know you are dead, and you know you are here."
"No! Fuck!" Barnabas punched the air. In his floating stasis, it was impossible to move around. He realized that his body was much younger than that of an 80-year-old. He was young again, back in his physical prime. He continued punching and kicking, rolled forward, backward, and sideways, roaring at God and the universe. Thoughts he'd had early on in his life returned, and he mulled them over rapidly, arriving at the conclusion that setting up a world in which atheism was the only rational mindset, and then sending people to eternal torment for not believing, was utterly despicable. God was clearly worse than the devil.
"Oh, but he is not,"
the demon said.
"You will come to see the error of that judgment soon enough."
"You can read my thoughts?" Barnabas asked.
"Why, of course, Barnabas. What kind of theme park did you think we were running down here? Hell is the place of ultimate violation. Your thoughts belong to us, not you."
The demon stretched its neck and shook itself. "This is not right. All my life I've been a good person. I've donated at least £1 million to charity.
Fed the homeless from your own kitchen, supported your local businesses, gave liberally to those in need, never charged interest on your loans, and trained over a dozen world-class chefs in your restaurants. You were at the end of your field, Barnabas Mullins, and all that was counted in your favor on Judgment Day."
The demon stepped closer to the edge of the rocky precipice, telescoping its neck far longer than it should have been able to, bringing it closer to Barnabas, but just outside of his reach. "But God is vain and wants to be worshipped, right?" Barnabas asked. The demon cackled.
"On the contrary, the big man upstairs is fond of those who are good because they want to be, not because they fear hell or crave heaven. Plenty of atheists up there, just not you."
The demon chattered its teeth, shaking its head. neck coiling like a slithering snake.
No, you are here for the greatest of sins, the gravest of insults. You see, when the Heavenly Father chooses to take a person's life, that point in time is always carefully chosen. He expects you to trust him that it is your time to go. But you couldn't, could you? You wanted to cheat death.
It took Barnabas a moment to remember. Of course, the cryolife contract.
Yes, indeed.
The demon laughed a guttural purr.
Not 10 minutes after your heart went out, they had you on ice. There was some brain damage, but the idea was that once they had the technology to thaw you, they should be able to repair it. But the body cannot live without the soul, Barnabas. When they finally began thawing people, none of them were truly alive.
Tears ran down Barnabas' face. He began sobbing uncontrollably, feeling the weight of the universe on his shoulders. "It's unfair!" he cried. "It's not fair how one thing, one decision, can damn you to hell forever. There was nothing in the Bible about this."
Well, nobody ever said it was fair, did they?
The demon's neck retracted back to its body. It turned around on the precipice, and Barnabas was pulled toward it, landing on his feet behind the demon. The ground was sharp as a field of razor blades, cutting open his feet. Barnabas hissed through the tears. The demon laughed.
You'll be in much worse pain soon enough, Barnabas. Don't be a ninny.
He drew back a curtain of intestines, slick with blood and feces, grabbed Barnabas' shoulder, and threw him into hell. It was just another day. Despite his initial attempts, Barnabas had lost track of them. What was the point if he was going to spend eternity in torment anyway? The last count he remembered was 476, much shorter than what his time down here had felt like, yet insignificant in relation to eternity. The few moments of respite he had were a kind of agony in and of itself, allowing him to think about the pain he lived with at every hour of the day. Sleep brought only nightmares, some worse than the torments of the pit in and of themselves. He was bound to a glowing pillar of ice, the chains around his wrists, neck, and ankles glowing with heat. Hot air blew onto his body from the front. It felt as though the temperature difference was tearing him apart. Earlier that day he had been inside a stomping press. It was a black box, devoid of light, and the ceiling crushed him against the ground at irregular intervals. The agony of being completely flattened over the course of slow seconds defied description, but the worst part was hearing his own bones snap. It was a kind of pain his mind could not fathom. Later, a meat hook had been rammed through his jaw, and he was hung from a rack with 1,000 other naked souls, roasting over open flames. Eventually, his own body weight would help the sharp hook cut through the bone and flesh of his jaw, and he would fall through the fire and into the embers, where ash would crawl into every orifice of his body, setting it ablaze from the inside, burning until he was nothing but a pile of ashes. The ice pillar was comfortable, relatively speaking. He could observe the ceiling of the caverns, dripping with blood, and see the shadows inside buildings rising in the distance. There were dozens of ice pillars here, all with prisoners of hell chained to them, presumably for the same ironic reasons as Barnabas. He would never be able to communicate. Every time he tried to talk to them, his voice was stuck in his throat, and every time he saw one attempting to communicate with him, it seemed as though their experience was much the same. Out of the corner of his eye, Barnabas spotted a group of visitors. Figures in black robes, hoods drawn deep into their faces, walking across the galleries of freezing prisoners with wooden sandals, talking in hushed tones in strange languages. Barnabas had no idea who they were, and no demon he'd asked had graced him with a response. But they were here, walking among the dead, people of all ages, skin colors and sizes, gawking at their tormented faces. Sometimes he clung to the idea that they were themselves former residents of hell who had served out their sentence and now lived a milder one, but it was more likely they were from heaven, looking at the poor souls condemned to eternal damnation. Maybe they were just another form of demon, a torment for the mind, designed to give hope where there was none to be had. As the group passed him by, one of them lingered. It was a young woman, her hood somewhat lifted, staring him in the face like only few of the visitors ever did. But her expression was not one of glee or disgust, but something Barnabas thought might be relief. There was something in her eyes, those dark brown eyes, that was familiar to him. Maybe he had seen them here in hell before, and she had indeed been absolved of her sins. If so, maybe he was soon to follow. There were 100 more torments before the young woman returned. He was chopped into pieces by a giant, faceless butcher with a rusty cleaver, and fed to the pigs, feeling every iota of pain in every minute patch of flesh. He was placed in a cage and prodded with spears by cackling goblins over and over, until there was nothing left of him but a pile of bloody bones. He was weighed down and thrown into the bottom of a boiling lake, feeling his skin and muscle tissue flake off as he drowned for hours. When the woman finally came back, Barnabas had all but forgotten about her. She was with a larger group this time, and had brought along someone else. A man, vaguely Asian-looking, but with blue eyes and a fuzzy blonde beard, looked at Barnabas with skepticism as the young woman whispered to him. Finally, he nodded, and a smile flashed across the woman's face. They left again, following their group. For the first time during his stay in hell, Barnabas was filled with genuine hope, and he didn't even know why. He was roasted on a spit, stuffed with fruit, and fed on a banquet to laughing demons, who dipped his legs in pure acid before chewing off his meat bit by bit with their razor-sharp teeth. He was placed in the middle of an endless void, standing atop rotting flesh, feeling ill in every cell of his body. He walked for what felt like eternities, retching and vomiting uncontrollably. He was decapitated, and his head was used as a ball in a strange field game the rules of which he did not quite understand. His extremities were used as bats, and his torso was a shield by what seemed to be a sort of goalkeeper. This time around, the man came along. He looked at Barnabas, tied to the ice pillar, with pity in his eyes. When the young woman arrived, he produced a pair of pliers much larger than his robe should have allowed for, and cut the chains binding his arms, legs, and head. Though the links were thick, and the man not particularly tall, he cut them with little effort. He produced a visitor's robe much like his own, and quickly draped it over Barnabas, who at first fell towards him, incapable of finding his feet. Finally, he was free, he thought. Finally, and unceremoniously, he had paid his dues. The torture was over. A mask was pulled over his face, but when he touched it a moment later, he could not feel anything but his own flesh. He followed the man as he walked briskly to catch up with a group of visitors who had passed his pillar before. It turned out that there were more than just a dozen, but hundreds, maybe thousands of people tied to the ice pillars. The visitors, a small group this time, walked by them briskly, as if in a hurry, but not fast enough to draw attention to themselves. After maybe an hour of walking, they arrived at a gate guarded by 2 massive demons armed with red tridents. They kept a close eye on the visitors as they passed through a splendidly decorated stone archway, stepping through what seemed to be a rippling red liquid, disappearing into it one by one. Barnabas stopped. Something in the back of his mind demanded he stay here, in hell, because that was where he belonged. Whatever was beyond this gate was not meant for him. In fact, the slurping and sloshing liquid was, in many ways, scarier than the abyss itself. Just when he was about to turn back, the man pushed him, and he practically fell through the archway, into nothingness. He awoke when the lid on his box was lifted, staring upward into the face of the young woman he had first seen so long ago. The bright light of the room she was in hurt his eyes. Barnabas drew in air reflexively and felt pain in his lungs. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, that was the only pain he felt. Compared to what he had experienced, it was barely a tickle. Though he wanted to rise, the young woman gently laid a hand upon his chest, and he understood. His head was stuck in a kind of cold metallic harness. There was a clicking sound, and suddenly he was free. She grabbed his shoulder and pulled up his torso, helping him out of the coffin. Barnabas found himself inside a small room with flan-coloured plastic walls sloping at odd angles, illuminated by soft, indirect light. In his feet, he felt a sway and a rumble going through the room. This was not some building, but a vehicle. Looking down his body, he realized that he was still young, much like in hell. It seemed different somehow, firmer, more solid, less like an illusion. He realized it only in retrospect, but there had been something fake about his body back in the pit. He turned around and watched the young woman close the lid of the box. It was a little larger than person-sized, like a sarcophagus, a golden cross embossed on the cover. It was plugged into various ports and tubes at the bottom, but most sockets remained empty. Barnabas wanted to ask what it was, but could only produce a weak croak. His throat was parched. The young woman rose and handed him a glass of water. Her expression was a mix of elation and deep sorrow. The water was sweet and refreshing, washing away what felt like sand grating in his throat, invigorating him. Barnabas expected to want more, but when the glass was empty, he handed it back, satisfied. The moment he looked into the young woman's eyes, he remembered. They were his son's eyes, his granddaughter's eyes, his great-granddaughter's eyes. "Kiri," he wheezed. Speaking was difficult. "Yes, it's me," she said, smiling. "I don't remember you, but you must remember me." "I remember." Barnabas stopped, recalling memories from a time so long ago it seemed unreal to him. "I remember holding you a few days after you were born. You grabbed my beard and held on with a kind of force no newborn should have had." Kiri laughed. "I'm glad to hear I was always like that. Once I grab a hold of something, I never let go." Barnabas felt his knees getting weak. His legs gave way, collapsing like a house of cards, and he fell backwards into a chair. The padding was cool and soft. "I was in hell," Barnabas muttered. The things that statement entailed ran through his mind. The cosmological implications, the realities, the consequences. If hell was real and he had escaped, what would God do when he died again? Kiri nodded slowly. "Yes, you were, but you also weren't." Barnabas squinted, looking at her. "What do you mean?" "Come, this will be easier if I introduce you first." Kiri led him through a long, narrow hallway. Several doors branched off to the left, but none to their right. At the end, the cap door slided open gently and revealed a room that Barnabas immediately recognized as a cantina. There was a large serving counter to the left and 4 long cream-colored tables with benches to the right, beside a large, gently curved window pane. It took Barnabas a moment before he realized that the blue beyond the glass was not the sky, but the sea. "We're underwater," he said matter-of-factly. "Yes, this is the Swift Celerity, named in a time where such redundancies were considered funny and ironic. I own a third of it, and so I am one of its 3 captains," Kiri explained. "You own a submarine?" Barnabas asked. "It's more than just a submarine. Just a few hours ago it was a spaceship, dropping at high speed from a chandelier city suspended from the transpolar orbital ring." Kiri gently touched the glass. "Right now we're in the middle of the Indian Ocean." "Orbital ring? What do you mean?" "A ring that goes around the Earth. There are 8 of them, and each has vast solar arrays and entire cities hanging from them. She paused. It's where they kept you. Hell? In space? I thought it was supposed to be deep underground. Barnabas felt as though he was moving through sludge in his brain. As I said, that wasn't really hell. It was a virtual reality construct, built to look and feel just like it. It is operated by a group of post-Christian pan-Abrahamists that dominates that specific Chandelier city. They call themselves the Disciples of the Cocytus. In their mind, all those who had themselves frozen before a certain, in my opinion, arbitrary deadline are sinners and need to be punished. Barnabas had to sit down on one of the benches again. Why would they do that? That's absurd! He stared at the floor for a few seconds. I'm a good person, he finally said. Kiri shook her head. You know how the people of your time looked back at slave owners? That is how many people of today look back at your generation. Even though you knew better, you ravaged the ecosystem of the planet for your own vanity, unwilling to give up an ever-increasing amount of luxuries, dooming future generations. You used to kill and eat animals, execute people with little evidence, and treat the poor as your personal playthings. People don't eat meat anymore? For some reason, this was the only question that came to Barnabas's mind. We do, but it's grown from stem cells. No living creature has to die for it. Kiri responded. I would have happily done that, but we didn't have that technology back then. Barnabas felt overwhelmed by her accusations. And what do you mean executing people? We abolished the death penalty in the 60s, and I drove an electric car for almost all my life. Now imagine a slave owner telling you that they needed the cheap labor back then. They eventually outlawed it, and he only reluctantly participated in the practice anyway. Kiri gave him a serious look. My crew and I are some of the few people who understand that people are a product of their times, and to see those who tried to live the best way they could as good people at heart. Most others would look down on you if they knew when you were alive, and some even do with me. Others would try to punish you for crimes against the planet, humanity, or whatever pet concept they believed marginalized in the 21st century. How few people are we talking about here that don't want to see me suffer eternal torment? Barnabas asked. He detected a hint of humor in his voice. That was probably good. Maybe 10 billion? Kiri shrugged. As I said, very few. Barnabas laughed. 10 billion! By Gordon's forehead, that has to be pretty much everyone. Kiri squinted, then relaxed as realization crept across her face. There are currently 350 billion humans alive in the solar system. We are very much a minority forced to cling to the fringes of society. Barnabas felt his mind falling backwards. His head was spinning, trying to imagine the absurdity of more people than had been alive during his lifetime being considered a minority. How far into the future are we? He finally asked. Far. I myself am over 500 years old. I am one of the oldest people alive. Barnabas's breath fell short. He began hyperventilating. The weight of these revelations seemed heavier than the existence of hell. Kiri put a hand on his shoulder, and after a few moments he'd calmed down again. I've been in hell for 5 centuries? Kiri shook her head. Barely a decade. There's a lot of frozen people from your time period, and the Disciples of the Cocytus bought up many cryopreservation companies before anyone ever learned about their plans. Only a fraction of the people they have were actually restored to life and inserted into the simulation. Barnabas almost jumped off the bench, pacing up and down the room. A second earlier he'd barely had the strength to support himself. Now it was like his body was charged with electricity. This was all a bit much. He had expected to wake up at some point in the future, young again, possibly even venerated as a piece of living history. The idea that he would be considered scum had never even entered his mind. It certainly should have. He looked out the window, into the darkening waters of the ocean, trying to find something to hold on to, but coming up empty. What do I have left? He finally asked. I mean, I had restaurants, book royalties. The Cryogenics Corporation was meant to maintain a fund for me. Your inheritance has long been dispersed, said Kiri. You have descendants everywhere. The old house in Cornwall where you died. My grandfather lived there for a while, I remember visiting, but my parents sold it. Too many old memories, and it had fallen into disrepair. Barnabas wanted to complain that they would have forgotten him so quickly, but remembered that he had done much the same thing with his own father's residence in Notting Hill after the old man had moved to Bermuda. I know your restaurants continue to be quite successful, but these things come and go. Any self-respecting book on the history of modern cuisine has a page dedicated to you, but that's about the extent of your legacy. Barnabas jerked backward. For the briefest of moments, his own reflection in the glass had become the face of a demon. He fell, looked around, the world was pressing down on him. The serving counter became a torturer's rack. The ceiling lights turned into open flames. The hum of the engines transformed into the growling of hellhounds. Kiri's hand touched his shoulder, and everything returned to normal. I spent a decade in hell, he said. Back when he had been alive, no person would ever have been able to experience what he had gone through. The human mind was not meant to withstand that kind of trauma. That's true, but it was not real. Remind yourself that it was all virtual, and that it's over now. Forever, said Kiri. Are there others like me? People who have been saved? Barnabas asked. From the disciples of the Cocytus? Kiri grimaced. Not many. They have very tight security up there. We're lucky that they need tourists to maintain their operation. Many of those whom we have saved over the years are broken. There must be a self-help group of sorts, right? Barnabas felt himself grinning but did not know why. I mean, this is the future. You must have the best drugs and therapists. We do, for the torments of life, but this virtual hell they created. Why did you go to the trouble of rescuing me? Something inside him was certain that he would have been happier in hell, not knowing the truth of this strange new world. It must have been dangerous. I could say that you're my blood, and many cultures still value that, which would not be wrong. But there's another reason, Kiri admitted. What? Barnabas had no idea what that meant. Kiri's words were barely more than sounds to him right now. I think this would be easier if you met the other captains. A few minutes later, 2 other people entered the mess hall. One of them was the man who had accompanied Kiri on her visits and who had rescued him from the virtual world. Barnabas noticed that his blue eyes had 2 pupils, and there were several skin-colored plastic panels on his bald head. He was dressed like an ancient Greek philosopher, but his toga was made out of a material that shimmered like mother of pearl. The other was a woman with blue skin that looked as though it had a texture like the shell of a peanut, and vivid orange eyes. Saw-like bony protrusions covered her cheeks, fluttering gently. She wore a practical one-piece overall that was made from something Barnabas assumed to be comparable to neoprene, and seemed to have neither breasts nor any significant behind. You already know Gossamer, Kiri said, gesturing toward the man. He's a virtual reality specialist. I think you would have called him a hacker if he'd been alive during your time. This is Racom. She's from Ganymede. Kiri touched the blue woman's shoulder as she said this. Racom then grabbed Barnabas's shoulder and looked him in the eye. I would like it known that I strongly objected to your rescue. Bringing the ties of brood into this may muddy our message, and I was not willing to risk that. Alas, I was overruled. The blades on her cheeks vibrated as her words atonally resounded in his head, but her mouth remained closed. We are currently on our way to Salongo, a city with considerable diplomatic influence in the Earth system. Gossamer spoke with a rough, guttural accent Barnabas could not place. They are currently hosting a conference on sapient rights.
and we are part of a faction that wants to introduce a resolution that would stop what the disciples of the Cocytus are doing.
Kiri nodded. In most jurisdictions, the dead have rights. The most common one is that their physical bodies cannot be destroyed if steps toward preservation have been taken, followed by it not being possible to seize their property without proper recompense, she explained. In order to do what they do, the disciples of the Cocytus have the minimum amount of rights for the deceased. We want to introduce a resolution that makes it illegal to insert cryopreserved deceased into virtual reality environments without their informed consent. This conference will lay the groundwork for when this is actually proposed at the United Nations. The United Nations still exists? Barnabas asked. Maybe this world was not quite so different to what he remembered. The United Nations is the precursor organization to this current organization's precursor organization. Just wanted to put it in terms you could relate to, Kiri elaborated.
At this conference, we needed to present evidence as to what the disciples of the Cocytus are doing, said Gossamer. They make no secret of their motivations, but visitors only ever get to see the mild tortures. We believe that the horror of your experiences will sway a lot of people.
I have no physical evidence. Barnabas felt the ground under his feet heat up and grow blades. He looked down, a wave of terror rolling over his body. The floor was normal, and the hallucination stopped. There is no evidence, he repeated. All I know and remember is in my head. Racom touched Gossamer's shoulder and looked him in the eyes. That will do, said Kiri. You will have to voluntarily subject yourself to a mental trawl so we can present your memories to the assembly. Gossamer nodded at Racom, then turned to Barnabas.
You will experience some of the things you've experienced in hell, going back to the most precise version of that memory in existence.
Barnabas stepped back. They wanted to put him back in there. It had been a trick from the beginning. If he did this, he would be back in hell, and the demons would laugh because he had gone of his own accord. No, never. It's pointless anyway, he blurted. If I'm not the first person you've rescued, surely you have presented the memories of others, and nobody listened to you then. Why should they listen to you now? There was a short silence heavy with meaning. They broke during the trawl, which is something that happens when you imagine complex lies during the process. Kiri looked out of the window into the ocean. The disciples have a method of making the memories of their hell function as lies. We do not have the strongest of reputations when it comes to telling the truth because of that. So you pulled me out there knowing I would go mad? The air seemed to be stuck in Barnabas' throat for a moment. He pushed himself against the wall, horns growing out of the heads of the three captains, their faces shifting to sadistic grins. One of the demons reached out for him, grabbing his shoulder. It was me who insisted to use you for a trawl. Do not blame Kiri. She did her best to spare you this fate, but considering the risk every one of us and our crew would be taking, you were not a racehorse I was willing to spare. The illusion was shattered. Despite her harsh words, Racom's touch was soothing. This is madness, probably quite literally for me. Barnabas pulled away. Please just leave me alone. I can't talk to anyone right now. He stormed off through the corridor and into the room that contained his coffin. Though the box was an element of the very same hell he had visited, it felt more familiar, safer than what was to come. He did not want to be trawled, and he did not want to relive his torments. All Barnabas wanted was to sit in the corner of his room and do nothing at all. The engine soothed his mind. After a while, not even the occasional shimmies could disconcert him. Barnabas hadn't the slightest clue as to how much time he'd spent down here. He wasn't even sure how many meals he had consumed. Upon closer inspection, it had turned out that the coffin contained a tube with a mouthpiece that delivered a kind of green jelly at regular intervals. It did not take a genius to realize that this was how it kept people fed while they were inside, and considering that he was in perfect physical shape, probably a lot better than he had ever been during his 20s, it was quite nutritious. A healthy body was apparently indeed a healthy mind, even in virtual reality. The coffin itself was connected to a tube of roughly the same size in the wall, and since Barnabas could not find a tank, he concluded that the crew of the Swift Celerity was continuing a supply of food, but was unwilling to disturb him. The jelly was mostly tasteless, with a vague hint of umami. Barnabas was getting sick of it, but the thought of leaving his room and going to the mess hall for some proper food was still more terrifying to him than the notion of sitting in this chair forever. He tried to stay awake, but fallen asleep twice. Barnabas had never been very good at remembering his dreams, and this time around was no different. All he knew was that he'd woken up screaming and drenched in sweat both times. The days he spent riding a never-ending sinus wave. There were periods of time where he simply lay on the floor, his mind a fog of ashes. But occasionally he would touch the flames that were tearing it apart, and that was when hell returned. It was never anything specific. There was no visual or tactile element to his experiences. Sometimes he smelt burnt flesh or tasted rotting feces, but only for brief moments. Barnabas was not experiencing memories, but pain, disgust, and humiliation in their purest forms. Whenever it ended, it felt as though that part of his mind had been consumed by the fire, and he was now wandering its remains, barely able to remember the torment that he had just experienced, or how long it had lasted. He hated both parts of the cycle, but in one he was too weak to even rise, and in the other he was convulsing in agony. At times he felt like he was standing inside himself, observing as a rational mind but unable to help. There was a knock on the cabin door. Barnabas did not know if he wanted to open it. If he did not know if he even could. After a few moments it opened on its own, and Kiri looked down on him, a sad smile on her face. "I'm not going to ask you how you're feeling, because I know." She spoke softly, as if being careful not to startle him. "I've seen this phase before. It's not pretty. But we are arriving in Solongo, and there is something I want to show you." There was a part of his mind that had been bored with all the lying around and doing nothing at all, and now it was the first to react and take control of his body. Barnabas jumped to his feet, full of energy, but feeling as though he was carrying a boulder. The muscles in his face did not respond to anything. He could neither smile nor frown. Kiri led him through the narrow corridor and into the mess hall. Though the sea outside was darker than it had been a few days ago, the ground below was well illuminated. Hundreds, thousands of little chambers were sitting in the sands, coffins like the one he'd been in, status lights blinking. They were arranged in circular patterns around central towers, where countless tubes and wires emerged to supply them with food, oxygen, and access to their simulation. "This is St. Halvard's necropolis," Kiri explained. "It is operated by an order of monks that have made it their mission to combat the disciples of the Cocytus by showing greater virtue. Most of those people were cryopreserved, like you. Because they died before biological senescence was cured, the monks do not believe they should be a part of the modern world, but they don't experience hell. The Order of St. Halvard simulates heaven instead." As the Swift Celerity moved forward, the clusters of coffins continued. There seemed to be no end to them. "They believe that not prolonging your life would be the same as murder," Kiri explained. "And as you will never be able to enter the afterlife if you live forever, they've taken it upon themselves to recreate heaven on earth. Many consider them to be the antithesis of the disciples of the Cocytus, and they're not wrong. They're very transparent and display their work openly. They do not allow visitors, but are financed through donations." "Why are you showing me this?" Barnabas asked. Kiri sighed. "The Archbishop of Solongo has offered you entry into the kingdom of heaven. He is a supporter of our cause and wants you to be trawled at the conference. Gossamer believes he has found a method of circumventing the disciples' memory encoding. What if I refuse? The Archbishop's offer stands nonetheless. He won't force you to go through any undue suffering, but you need to understand that either way, it's a one-way ticket. Once you enter their simulation, you will never be able to leave. Kiri looked down at the necropolis with melancholy. I resisted the idea, but frankly, it would be selfish of me to force you to stay here. With what you've gone through, I am not sure you'd ever find a place in this world. I can't keep you just because I want a piece of the world I knew when I was young to be around. A tear rolled down Barnabas' cheek. He found himself smiling. I'll do it, he decided. I will subject myself to this trawl, Kitty, and then we'll see. Are you sure? She asked. You literally saved me from hell. This is the least I can do. This and a fine gourmet meal for you and your crew. Kiri laughed. It was a short, joyful chortle. She looked at her great-grandfather, a little girl in spite of her age. Thank you, she whispered, then shuffled away. Barnabas had expected the trawling machine to look like some kind of medieval torturing instrument, standing in a dimly lit parliament of steel and concrete. Instead, it was little more than a chair with a filigree headpiece attached, sitting in a small, round room. Water was streaming softly over the polished bronze walls, and planter boxes stood on either side of the door. The doctor, a soft-spoken man with dark brown skin and radiant yellow eyes, had introduced himself as Avanato, and was wearing what looked like a mixture of a light blue uniform and a navy lab coat. I will be here with you, if you wish, to ensure your mental safety. You're not actually the one performing the trawl. For some reason, this mattered to Barnabas. Avanato shook his head. My colleagues are in the adjacent room, and they will administer the procedure, with the assistance of Gossamer. There is also a team of independent experts that will verify what they are seeing. Witnesses, like at an execution. It made him uncomfortable. Avanato looked confused, then gave him a reassuring smile. That reference is so old it's not even in most history books. The witnesses are there to make sure the results of this trawl are given credence. We don't like being accused of lying. Barnabas nodded. He was feeling nothing at all, and at the moment that was probably a good thing. Let's get this over with before I change my mind. You are a strong person, Barnabas, said Avanato. You'll get through this, and I will see to it that you do. Barnabas took a deep breath, leaned backward, and closed his eyes. I hope you're right. He was back. The transition had been abrupt and not at all gentle. He had expected the room to crumble and fold back, or for the door to open and him tunneling through, but now he was simply here, naked, tied to the ice pillar again. Barnabas realized immediately the mistake he'd made. He was staring into the face of a demon, the very first demon he had met, the fires in its eyes flickering with glee only a hand's length away from his face.
Glad to see you've chosen to return, Barnabas. I'd been getting worried you'd lost yourself in your fantasy.
Its face came closer, breath smelling like sulphur.
I've been trying to get through to you, and it seems like I succeeded.
That was no fantasy. You're the fantasy, Barnabas croaked. He was having a difficult time believing his own words. The demon cackled, retracting its face from him and gesturing around the ice pillars in a sweeping motion.
You humans never fail to amuse.
Its spine swung around, skull still staring at him as the body was turned away.
All your life, every night, you dreamt. You dreamt in here, even. Do you know why?
The science is still out, Barnabas said quietly.
There is no science, Barnabas. You know that. Deep down, you know. I, for instance, do not dream. I do not dream because only the children of God dream. The entirety of the universe is God's dream, and hell is Lucifer's dream. When they taught you that God is in everyone, they meant it. You have a little piece of God in you, and that is the piece of you that dreams up these pathetic, temporary little worlds with no rules or meaning to them.
To his surprise, that gave him a little hope. The place I was in, the real world, it wasn't fleeting. It was real. It had fundamental laws, and it worked perfectly fine.
Oh yes, you unlocked your piece of the divine. That is true.
The demon turned back toward him fully.
You built your own little world, allowed yourself to be carried into it. You're an old soul, Barnabas. You have a few tricks up your sleeve. What you need to remember is that I have more. And every time you retreat into your little fantasy, I will get you out, just when you feel secure in your reality again. If you don't come running back first.
Why would I come back here? Barnabas demanded. The demon's explanation did not make sense, but his negotiation was new. It gave him the slightest shred of confidence that maybe, just maybe, this was not real after all.
You're here now, aren't you? You came back because you chose to, because you know that this place is where you belong.
The demon chattered its teeth.
And every time you leave again, after you come back, the punishments you've already endured will be child's play compared to those you will suffer.
Maybe it was a self-destructive streak he never thought he'd had, but Barnabas said, "I don't believe you," and spat squarely in the demon's face. It was a lie, but the demon did not seem to care.
All right then, I'll let you off easy this time. Just the regular hell routine.
And why would you do that? Barnabas asked.
Because unlike God, I am merciful.
He laughed. It was at that moment Barnabas realized that hell was not real. He was sat onto a throne of spikes, sinking slowly in agony, as though pressed ever deeper into the contraption, until finally someone else was sat down on top of him. He was attached to a wheel and driven for hours over a field of searing hot razor blades. Imps greased the wheels with pure acid, and a giant wrung him out from time to time before pulling him back on the wheel. He was encased in a sea of molten lead, the metal entering every orifice, cooling solid, expanding, and bursting his body apart. He was set ablaze in a lake of gasoline, thrashing and flailing in ever hotter flames, until the fire was stopped when a bucket of magma was poured over his head. He was locked in a pot full of shit, piss, and vomit, and left to stew inside it over an open flame for hours. He was flayed and thrown into a desert made of salt, his skin regrowing, locking the salt underneath, constantly burning his skin. It hurt so much that he scratched it all away, exposing it to even more grains. When he was finally brought back to his ice pillar, it felt like weeks had gone by. All of those tortures he had experienced before, all of those tortures had been so unspeakable that they were difficult to even remember. All of those tortures had not been real. Barnabas fell asleep, ready to wake in the real world.
And we're done,
Evanato said softly the moment Barnabas opened his eyes.
You did splendidly. A whole minute of trawling with those kinds of memories. Excellent readings, too. You're a hero, Barnabas.
Barnabas took a deep breath. It was over. It was finally over.
Thank you,
he said.
Oh no, thank you,
Evanato insisted.
You will return to hell, Barnabas. You cannot escape me.
Barnabas was shell-shocked for a moment. What the bloody hell did you just say?
I asked if you'd like a glass of water.
Evanato smiled, but Barnabas could have sworn that his eyes flickered like fire for a moment.
If you liked this story and would like to hear more,
please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. A new short story is uploaded every Wednesday, and there will occasionally be another one in between if I find the time. Thank you very much for listening and have a great day.